right?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, should we start, Ajahn Supong? Or should
Okay.
we wait?
Maybe 1 or
Right.
2 minutes.
Okay,
What?
How many people are there in the
right. 1, 2, 2 right now, right? I think more are coming.
or 122, 122?
122 right now, the participants. I mean, if you take a look at the number of participants right now,
Oh yeah.
We'll just
right?
We'll
Right.
just
Yeah,
wait.
some are also greeting us, right? And you remember Mintra, right? You're
Yeah.
from Cooley.
But it's like almost 500 people, right? That have
So
registered.
we just need to wait a little bit longer.
Yeah.
We
Maybe.
should have got a we should have put together a quiz for everybody to do before we
Maybe.
start.
Yeah. Maybe they have just finished their breakfast or just finished their showers.
Somebody from the Philippines. Wow. Amazing. You can begin if you wish. Okay, we've been given permission. Time.
เอาแล้วแม่พี่จูเดี๋ยวจะรออีกแป๊บหนึ่งแต่กำลังมาเพิ่มเรื่อย
It's gone.
ๆฮะ
I think Boom is asking you something. Hello
Asking-
from Indonesia.
So the
Indonesia. Yeah, you can begin if you wish, right? That's from Boom, nah. Okay.
morning.
Hi. So
Maybe we can start.
good morning, everyone from Thailand, right? Or maybe afternoon elsewhere, or maybe evening. Good evening, someone who is from some other parts of the world, right? So this is the secondly two webinar, okay, hosted by Language Institute, Thammasat University, right? And today we have Associate Professor Dr. Avril Coxhead from Victoria, University of Wellington, right? So I would like to invite the Director of Language Institute, Thammasat University, Associate Professor Dr. Supong Tangking Sirisin, to give an opening speech now.
Okay, good morning from Bangkok, Thailand. So welcome to the webinar organized by the Language Institute of Thammasat University. Today we have our best friend from New Zealand with us, Dr. Avril Coxhead. And as you all know, Dr. Coxhead is an expert in vocabulary research and teaching. And that's our webinar topic today. ELT or EFL teachers are always interested in teaching vocabulary to their students. Without enough vocabulary, students cannot read or write well. So teachers have been trying to use many different techniques to increase students' vocabulary knowledge, recall, and retention. And there's also a lot of research that is useful for vocabulary learning and teaching. So our guest speaker today will not disappoint you, and she has never disappointed her audience when she talks about vocabulary. Today, let's learn more about vocabulary research and teaching from our distinguished speaker, Dr. Avril Coxhead, and have a nice day today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Supong, for a very nice opening speech, right? So right now, let me briefly introduce Dr. Coxhead, right? Associate Professor Dr. Avril Coxhead is from School of Linguistics and Applied Language Studies, Victoria, University of Wellington, from New Zealand. Dr. Coxhead is an associate professor in applied linguistics, and she teaches courses on second language learning in undergraduate TESOL and the MA in applied linguistics and TESOL programs. Avril has taught in New Zealand and many other countries, for example, England, Estonia, Hungary, and Romania. Her current research includes specialized vocabulary in the trades at university and secondary school, right? Everyone around the world knows Professor Coxhead by her, world-renowned academic word list in 2000, right? apart from that, she has also developed many other word lists, right? And also, you know, she has been conducting a lot of research in vocabulary learning and teaching. So everyone, please welcome Dr. Coxhead. Before I leave the floor to Dr. Coxhead, right, I'd like to inform all of you that while she's giving a talk, right, she might give you some time so you can have some chat or discussion, and she's going to respond to some of the major questions. And you know, we are going to have about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of her talk, right? So you can join, and you can ask question by, you know, writing your messages, and you know, we are going to make you know, an effort to let Professor Coxhead entertain all of your questions. So thank you very much, Professor Coxhead. All right.
Okay. Thanks very much, folks. So first of all, I'd like to say good morning to everybody, and thanks very much for joining us all here today. My name, as you know, is April Coxhead, and I am going to be talking into this topic today. So vocabulary in English in tertiary context, connecting research and practice. Now, maybe like me, you've been in lockdown for the last little bit. So you can see already that my hair is lockdown hair. So I'm getting a haircut on Tuesday, which I'm looking forward to very much. So what are we going to be doing today? So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that we have a lot going on in our world at the moment. So I just wanted to acknowledge the huge personal and professional challenges of this year. And I'm very grateful that you've taken the time to be with us together today, to be thinking about research and teaching, and it's your weekend. I have a kind of a prayer really for teachers there, which is in Te Reo Māori first and then in English. So I just wanted to say, be brave, be strong, and be steadfast. So again, thank you very much to Thammasat University for this opportunity. Now I've organised my talk. Hopefully this is going to make some sense. I asked some questions. So the first bit of the talk is going to be looking at planning. So why are we looking at vocabulary for learners who are going to be studying an English medium university? How much vocabulary do people need? What happens between subjects? Is there much variety? These are some of those questions. I'm going to move to look at strategies after that. And in strategies, I'm going to be looking at one particular strategy, and then I'm also going to talk about word lists because I think that they belong in that kind of strategy-based area. The third part is looking at testing. So how can we find out about how much vocabulary, academic vocabulary our students know? And then I'm going to be talking a little bit about teaching. Now, you might be a bit disappointed because I'm not going to be giving you lots and lots of different ways to be working with academic vocabulary in the classroom. I'm going to be primarily looking at what we need to be thinking about in our planning, what we need to be thinking about in terms of strategies, a little bit about testing, and then how you can work with your texts in the classroom to find out more about the vocabulary that's in them. So then we'll have time for questions, I hope. Now, at the moment, I can't see the questions, so I am just going to keep going with what I'm doing, and I'll check them soon. Okay. So first of all, I've got a couple of big ideas that I want to engage with just to make sure that we are all working from the same ideas. So Paul Nation, Professor Paul Nation, my mentor, colleague, and friend, talks about the jobs of a vocabulary teacher. And he says there are 4 main jobs, and I've structured this talk around those 4 main jobs. So the first main job is planning, not teaching, planning. This must sound familiar because I've just used the same framework in the slide before, right? Slide 2 is strategy training. So teaching learners to be better learners. We need to be testing and monitoring their progress. And then the final part is around teaching. So that's why I've followed that framework today. Now, just a little bit more about this talk. When you see this symbol, what I'm going to ask you to be doing at that point is having a bit of a think, maybe making some comments in the chat about these things. And then we're going to come back to these ideas as we come through. So again, as Supokon was saying, we're going to make sure that we're using the chat function as much as we can. I find the chat function a little bit distracting, so I'm going to try and keep talking and then refer to it when possible. Okay. Now, another one of my big ideas is this one, which is that nobody is a native speaker of academic English. Now it's time for you in your chat function. What do you think this means to you and your students? I'm going to give you guys 15 seconds to have a chat about that. Go. Nobody is a native speaker of academic English. What does that mean to you? Yeah, I can see some really good answers. Academic English is a foreign language to all of us, and nobody is born speaking it. Yep, quite right. I absolutely agree with you. So this is, I think that the kinds of comments that are coming up are absolutely what I was thinking about when I think about this idea of nobody is a native speaker. So one of the main ideas is we don't spend all day and every day reading academic texts and talking about academic concepts and ideas. It's not the only thing that we do in a day, right? That's one important point. Another is that access to academic ideas could be limited. For example, the written text can be very dense, so they contain a lot of unknown words, for example, and they're written in a very particular way. So they're not written like your shopping list for going out to do your shopping in the days when you can go out and do your shopping in COVID-19 time. Another access point is whether or not people are in school or not can be a really important point. So if you are spending every day working in a garden, for example, or doing something which doesn't involve academic ideas and concepts, then that's limiting. And there's a researcher called David Corson, may he rest in peace, and he talks about the impact of social factors and economic factors as having an impact on whether or not people have access to academic ideas. Now, there's one more point about this, which I think is really important, is that it's a bit confusing really, but some of the vocabulary that we use to talk about everyday things and some of the vocabulary we use to talk about academic things are the same words, but we're using them in a very particular way when it comes to academic text. So for example, area in mathematics and significant in statistics. If you know the everyday meaning of those words, that's good, but sometimes they have a very particular meaning in those areas of study. Now, that can be a problem, right? Because if you don't have access to the text or the academic ideas, then you don't get exposure to the language that you need. And then there could be economic factors or social factors that stand in your way as well. So this is no small task for learners to become more of a native speaker of academic English. And it's true, as somebody said in the chat, it's true for everybody, right? We're not born this way. Maybe if we were born that way, it'd be quite easy. Not sure how we will manage that. Okay, a couple more key terms, and then we'll get going. So one of the main ideas I wanted to talk about today involves frequency and vocabulary. So high frequency words are usually referred to as the first 2,000 or 3,000 words, so the most frequent words in the language. Mid is kind of 4,000 to 8,000-ish, and low frequency, Bharti Alaufa, another friend and vocabulary specialist, calls low frequency vocabulary who cares, because nobody needs it, right? But one of the challenging things with academic English is that it can belong to high frequency vocabulary, mid or low frequency vocabulary, as Paul Nation points out in his lovely book about making and using word lists for language teaching and language learning. I'm just having a look over on my bookshelf there because it's there. So if you don't have access to academic text, or if there are barriers to accessing academic ideas, say, for example, you're a language learner somewhere like Thailand or somewhere like Taiwan, for example, and you have challenges with even the first 1,000 words of English, then access to academic text is going to be difficult for you too. I hope that makes sense. Now, a couple of numbers are going to come up next. So one of the areas of research which Paul Nation has been very active in, I think that he really pushed this area forward a lot, is looking at how many words and what kinds of words make up a text. And there are two kind of magic numbers here. So if students know know about 95% of the words in a text, that in terms of comprehension, they'll still need a bit of help, but they should be getting okay in terms of the comprehension. If they know 98 and above 98%, okay, then they know lots of the vocabulary in that text and can probably cope. If there are lots and lots of unknown words in a text, and I know about this when I read in my second language, which is Hungarian, I know I really, really struggle if there are many, many unknown words in the text, because I just find it difficult to understand the text in any way. So really what we're looking for here is making sure that we're working with text that students know quite a lot of the most of the vocabulary of. So we're going to be coming back to these ideas soon. The last one I wanted you to know about is that we often talk in vocabulary studies about word families. And word families are an important concept because you have single words like analyze, analysis, analytical. And if you put all those words together, then they make up a family, right? So a word family is quite a big unit of counting for words. So when we're talking about frequency and vocabulary, the first 1,000 words, what I'm talking about there really is the first 1,000 word family. So not just 1,000 words, single words, but each word has a family to it. Now, there's a bit of an argument about this in vocabulary studies, but for now, I'm not going to argue with anybody. I just want you to know that when I talk about word families, I'm talking about a whole unit of words that I see as being belonging together. Okay, now what I thought I'd do after talking about some of these key terms is to look at why vocabulary is important. And Professor Supong started by saying that if you don't know much vocabulary, then actually life is very difficult for you as a language learner. So vocabulary is essential, as he said, in all of our skills. We know this. Another thing we know is that learners who have big vocabulary sizes are usually more proficient than the learners with small vocabulary sizes. So then the question becomes, how big is okay, right? So Jim Milton, who's a researcher in vocabulary studies and assessment in Swansea in the UK, he suggests that learners need about 3,000 words minimum. But we've seen in research, and this is where things get a little bit depressing, is that actually when we test learners, we see quite low levels of vocabulary knowledge in English in secondary school and early university, at the start of university. So where is that true of? Well, we see research where people have been looking at the vocabulary levels test, for example, in places like Taiwan, with research by Webb and Chung, in Denmark as well. And we did some research, TJ Butterwick and I, on an international school in Germany, and we found quite low levels of vocabulary knowledge there. And more recently, with an updated levels test, I'll come to these tests later on as well, with Chinese high school students, with Sun and Dang. Dang is a former PhD student of mine. She's now at Leeds University, and they also found very low levels of vocabulary knowledge. Now, is it that the learners are not taking the test seriously, or is it that they really don't know this vocabulary? If they're not taking the test seriously, that's one thing. But if they really don't know this vocabulary, then that's it's a really big problem, right? I'm going to show you some data. And in this data, you will see 95%, which means learners need help doing okay, but they need help with the vocabulary. 98% means they should be good to go. And I'm showing you data which is based on looking at how many word families, or the word size, the vocabulary size people need for understanding different kinds of spoken texts. So here we go. Right. So I've got this table in front of you. I'm going to be quiet. It's not easy for me. I'm going to be quiet, and I'd like you to have a bit of a chat in the chat box about what you see here. So you've got general spoken discourse in the column on the left, laboratory sessions, so science-based university text, tutorials, kind of more humanities-based, small group talking, and then lectures and seminars. So using the chat function, I'm going to give you about half a minute or so. Have a chat about what do you see there? What's important? Go. Yeah, exactly that. Not just participate, but it's also understanding the spoken English, right? Yeah, a lot of high frequency words. Really remember that the 3,000 at this point, oops, the 3,000 at this point is the number of word families that you need. So that's important as well. Okay. So when I look at this, what I see is that for that kind of minimum comprehension, it's all roughly the same. 3,000 lectures and seminars are a bit more at 4,000, but then look at the jump to the 98%. That jump to the 98% is the really scary part. Again, 3,000 is the threshold. You're quite right about that. Thank you very much from Japan. So if we look at the sciences in the second column of the table, so laboratory sessions, look at the jump from 95% to 98%. So you got 4,000 word families there, but only 3% coverage difference. But in tutorials, it's 3,000 to 4,000. I think that's really interesting. So what that's telling us is if you're preparing your students to understand general spoken discourse, it will do them good because of they'll be able to hopefully understand laboratory sessions and tutorials and lectures and seminars as well. And as Jim Milton's saying, that 3,000 is pretty close there, isn't it? And then if you're getting to 98%, you need a lot more vocabulary, okay? Now, I think this recent research in terms of spoken academic English is really important because most research up until now is really focused on written texts. Now, in some work that I did with an international school in Germany, I looked at, with some colleagues, looked at what happens in different subject areas when you analyze teacher talk in secondary school. So here's your question for the chat as well, is what's your prediction of how many word families like this, 95%, 98%, do you think that people will need for maths, science, and English language classes in terms of how many thousands of words? So when teachers are talking, how much vocabulary do you think your learners need to understand you at high school is your question. Chat away, folks. Mark, good answer. Yeah, and only Mark, thank you for that. All right, great. So here you go. So this table is actually the opposite direction, isn't it, from the other one? So sorry about that. Might take a little bit to get used to the what you're seeing there. You can see that English as an additional language, maths and science is all quite similar, but learners in the secondary school with this teacher talk needed fewer vocabulary word families knowledge than they did for university level. So it's quite different. Again, we see the jump in science, and you can see a jump in maths as well from 3,000 to 7,000. So that's telling us about the nature of the vocabulary that's getting used for those science and math subjects. And it's more than what's happening in the English as an additional language class, or the English language class. So I think that this is a very small study, but I think we need to do a lot more work in this area to find out much more about what the vocabulary is that teachers are using, because teachers in many places in the world are the main source of vocabulary for students, teachers, and textbooks. And we're going to be talking about textbooks soon. Okay. So I've been talking about planning so far, and what I've been talking about here is planning for what? So we're talking about when our learners are going into lectures and going into seminars and going into laboratory sessions at university, what kind of talk are they going to be exposed to? And the answer is they're going to be exposed to a lot, and they really need that very basic vocabulary to help them understand that. Okay. Now, another bit of planning is to understand what our learners are planning for in terms of their study. So what I've got for you here is a long list of abbreviations, and some of them you might recognize already. So your job now is, as I put them up, ask us to put the answers in the chat. Yes, there was a question there about, are they the same words? And the answer to that is yes, most of them are. What about this one? English for specific. Yeah, very good. English medium instruction, correct. The last one's my favorite. I'm just going to click on that. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. Oh no, there we go. So I'm getting some answers up for you now. So you can see here we've got EAP and EGAP. Some of you got some of these. That's great. Good to see. This one was a bit tricky, English for traditional Chinese medicine. That's because I've been doing some research with a colleague, Chai-Ling Lu, former PhD student now in China. Specific media, you can see there are a whole lot of things here, English for research publication purposes, and then hopefully my favorite comes up, teaching English for no obvious reason. So the main issue with teaching English for no obvious reason is, of course, if we don't know what our students need, then how can we be planning for their purposes in terms of vocabulary? Okay. Now, I've talked about why vocabulary is important. Academic vocabulary is important because if we want to be able to understand ideas and express ourselves clearly in an academic context, we're going to need this language, right? And what are some of the features of those academic texts? Very dense texts, and as I said before, there are limitations including social factors and access and economic factors if you don't have the money. Yeah, tenor, I love that too. And I've said before that we use some of the same vocabulary. So we've got a challenge there as well, haven't we? Because if you know the everyday word and you need to do a little bit of work to make sure that you understand the specific word, then actually that can be difficult for people. And even native speakers have trouble with this. I interviewed some teachers in the New Zealand context, and one of the physics teachers said, "Oh, this just drives me crazy." She said, "I try and make sure I use the scientific meaning of words, but my students never seem to pick up on it." And she said, "It's all the same. Doesn't matter if they're non-native speakers of English or native speakers of English. Everybody needs to learn this." So they need to learn, for example, that respiration does not mean the same thing in chemistry as it does in everyday language. And we've been doing some work in this field. I'll tell you a bit about that soon. Something else is the high, mid, and low frequency vocabulary and whether our learners have exposure to that language. And then another thing that I'm going to come back to as well is that many of the items in the work that I did on the academic word list showed that actually Greek and Latin vocabulary played a major role in that word list. So that tells us a little bit too, doesn't it, in terms of the kinds of knowledge that you might need in order to understand academic vocabulary and to really learn more. Okay. Now, in my list of abbreviations, apart from teaching English for no obvious reason, we had English for general academic purposes. And one of the tasks that I wanted you to do was to have a bit of a think about what is it that is very specific to English for general academic purposes. What's the general about? So away you go on the chat. What do I mean by general? Go. Oh. Could be. Yeah, all disciplines. Yeah, there we go. No specific field of study. Absolutely. Yep, you're absolutely cooking with gas, everybody. So when I think about general academic purposes, I'm looking at the vocabulary which occurs across academic disciplines. So they're shared. And in the work that I did with academic word list vocabulary is that these words are general in nature, but they're important for all areas of study. And I've got some examples for you there, furthermore research and concept. So you can find these words in all kinds of academic texts in different disciplines, and they are shared, right? Now, these words are not so common in other kinds of texts. So one of the things I often think about is that if you were constantly using words like hitherto and furthermore in your speaking, around the family dinner table. So instead of saying and, you said furthermore. I think people would start thinking, well, why are you using academic vocabulary in this context? When I did some research looking at where learners got their knowledge of academic vocabulary from, one of the participants, who is Samoan, was saying, I think it was furthermore. She said, that's my husband's word. He went to university and he came home with that word, furthermore. So now you can't argue with him anymore because he uses this academic vocabulary in his speaking. So he changed the nature of the conversation around the dinner table. Now, when I interviewed him as a learner in a university context, he said, yeah, I took this language home because I really want my family to understand that academic vocabulary is an important thing. They need to know about it. So he understood that to bring this vocabulary into everyday talk was something that was really important for him and for his family. So if you think about it, it gave him practice, but then he was introducing this language to the people that he loved to try and help them with their further education. Now, when we look at academic word lists, what we find is large amounts of general academic vocabulary. So the academic word list, my work, and we'll talk about this again soon, covered around 10% of written academic text, and there's 14% from a newer list called the Academic Vocabulary List from Gardner and Davies. And if you haven't seen that website, academicvocabulary.info, you must go and look at it. It's a fabulous website. It's just great, really wonderful, really good resource for teachers. Now, spoken academic texts carry even more academic vocabulary. So we've got the new spoken academic word list, which was created by Yen Dang, and I worked with Stuart Webb as well with this particular project and Yen's PhD. And what she found is there's a lot of high frequency vocabulary in academic spoken English as well. So I'm going to come back to these three lists soon. So don't worry don't worry about this. We will come back to it. So this idea of the number of academic words in a text is really important, I think, because I had a student once from China, lovely guy, he called himself Jerry. And Jerry studied in my English for Academic Purposes class, and then he studied for a year at university. And at the end of his first year at university, it was a big year for him. And at the end of his first year of university, he came to my office and he knocked on the door and he said, April, you know the academic word list? And I said, yep. He said, I see those words all the time. And I thought, go, Jerry. So he'd understood that these academic words, he was seeing them all throughout his university text, and he had understood from my class and from his own understanding, he'd developed this academic vocabulary awareness. Now, when we're talking about academic vocabulary, we're not just talking about words on their own, right? So these are not just single words. We also get multi-word units, and I'm going to be talking about multi-word units a little bit later in the workshop. So if you look at things like on the basis of, what I'm talking about with multi-word units is several words that belong together, right? Now, one of the things I found out with on the basis of is that you need to kiss a lot of frogs before you find a handsome prince. So in other words, on the basis of is not very frequent in academic texts. It tends to occur maybe once or twice every 15,000 words, 15,000. So one of the dangers with multi-word units is trying to find that exact combination of words in academic texts. They tend not to be so frequent. That's a bit of a challenge. One more thing about English for general academic purposes, and I could see that the PowerPoint wants me to move on and not talk so much, is that learners don't tend to know this vocabulary as well as they know the technical vocabulary of the field. So that general vocabulary can be problematic because they think they know it for a start, or because they are so focused on the technical vocabulary of the field. So the other part, which is really important about English for general academic purposes, is that Paul Nation says this is something that EAP teachers can help with. You don't need specialized knowledge. We'll come to the academic and non-academic. I'm going to give you some examples soon. Okay, now, are these words everyday words or are they general academic words, folks? What do you reckon? Use the chat. Do you think that these are... Oh, it's going faster for me. Anyway, here we go. So I'm going to stop. How do I stop this going so quickly? Here we go. I'll come back again. So these items all here, 10 Stephen Johnson's Fish, Radical and Culture, they look like they should be everyday items. But when Betsy Kero did some work on medical text, she found actually 10 stood for something which was very specific, and that's toxic epidermal, something you don't really like the sound of. And then, sorry, and then I must have it on some sort of move forward thing. I don't mean to. So the point here is that you might think, oh, these words are not technical in nature, but actually they do represent quite specific things in academic text. So we need to be very careful. So if learners think they're reading about fish, but they're not, they need to know that. Okay. So we've been looking at general purposes. And now I want to talk about the specific. Now, clearly, specific purposes is going to be just that, right? So that's looking at words that occur mostly in one particular subject area or one discipline. Usually they're more technical than general in nature, and they're likely to be content carrying. So one of the contrasting points that somebody was asking for is that Kazushi is saying, oh no, Carlo is saying, how do you distinguish academic to non-academic? The general academic words would be the ones that are common across subject areas. Discipline specific are the ones that commonly occur just within that subject area and are very closely tied to the topic. Non-academic would be your everyday words. So one way that you can distinguish between them is that everyday words, you'll be looking at the context of how they're being used, and academic text words tend to appear mostly in academic text. If they are an everyday word that's being used in a new way, then you'll be looking at the context of the sentence to try and work out what the meaning is, or you might be calling in a subject specialist or using your tools on Google to try and find out about the meaning of that word. I'd be using learners too, because they know a lot. Technical vocabulary or subject-specific vocabulary is less likely to be known by people who don't know much about the subject. So if you're somebody who's never read much in biology like me, then my knowledge of biology vocabulary is actually really limited, whereas somebody who's a biologist would know a lot more about it. So the more your learner knows about the subject area, so if they're studying psychology, the more knowledge they have about psychology in Thai or Indonesian or whatever language they have their background knowledge is in, the more likely it is that they will know the specific vocabulary related to that subject area because of their knowledge that they've already got, right? Now, there are subject-specific academic word lists, things like the chemistry word list, the medicine word list, engineering word list, and some of this work has been done in Thailand, for example. So you can see this is quite different, right? The names of those are the sort of chemistry word list, a medical word list. They are not general academic word lists. I hope that makes sense. And we'll come back to these lists again soon. All right. Now, one of the most important things I think about this whole idea of discipline-specific vocabulary is that we used to think that these words did not make up a very big proportion of a text, but actually recent research, starting with work by Paul Nation and Teresa Chung, who's now in Korea, they found that the vocabulary actually could make up between 20 to 30% of a text written in that area. So specialized discipline-specific vocabulary makes up a large amount of text, even in plumbing and even in rugby. So one of the questions is, does it have to occur in the discipline or can it be shared, which is one thing that we've seen. Another thing is that actually when you look at spoken text compared to written text, there's a lot less technical or discipline-specific vocabulary in the speaking than there is in the writing. Oh, and it's moving me on again. Sorry, folks. So one of the things to think about with discipline-specific vocabulary is it might depend on your area of study, but things like medicine, there is a lot more technical vocabulary in medicine than there is in different areas, in other subject areas. And what we found in spoken trades-based vocabulary is around 10% of the text. Spoken text were technical, and around 30 to 40% of the written. So in other words, if your students are preparing for written text, there's going to be a lot more discipline-specific vocabulary in the written than in the spoken. Okay. So I've got some examples for you. I went online, as we like to do. And I found some links of some different kinds of text. And your job now is to say, oh, what do you reckon this discipline is? Where do you see any vocabulary that's specific to the discipline or any vocabulary which is general? Okay. And this is from a portal, an EAP portal. So I hope that this isn't going to move this on very quickly, but here are the examples of the text. What's the topic? Is it general EGAP or is it specific? Not a very nice first example, sorry. I've got 3 examples for you. So if you can put EGAP or ESAP words, then put them into the chat. Yeah, food science, quite right. And which words do you think would be very specific? So I think infection would be an example of a discipline-specific word. Consumption, probably another one, right? Undercooked poultry. Ugh. So I think you've got it. Specific, yes, expected, quite right. Okay, here we go. Here's another one. This might look familiar. So what we're doing here is we're trying to identify the general academic and the specific. So I think that learner-centered and process approach would all be discipline specific. Yeah, learner-centered, quite right. Yeah. Whereas widely adopted, I think, is more general, right? Great. Here's your last one, folks. So what's the topic area? Where do you see specific and where do you see general academic vocabulary? Yeah, L2 is definitely specific. Yeah, these are all examples of academic text. News story. Yeah, but the news is usually written for 12-year-olds, right? This has got sentences in it like essential to the success of integration and all its guises. Whew. Whew. Quite heavy. I think this is a political science. Yeah, quite right. You found some English for specific academic purposes in there. So what I've been trying to do with this slide is to pull out some examples of academic text so that we can be saying, well, where do you see general academic vocabulary? Where do you see specific? Now, these ones are written. What I'm going to move on to next is an example of a spoken academic text. And this is from the Bohr corpus. No, base corpus. I've got that wrong. Sorry, it's base, not Bohr. Sorry about that. So this is a life and medical science lecture. Now, take a look at this. Now that we've looked at the written, take a look at the spoken stuff. And the speaker starts, just for those who perhaps were the far side of the room, when I was introducing myself, what sort of vocabulary do you see here? Yeah, round robin is really just talking about people talking in a round. So you'd say introduce one idea and then the next person does the next, and next person does the next one. Yeah, you're quite right about this. There's a lot of high frequency vocabulary here, and this person is just talking to the room, introduce himself or herself and saying and sort of setting the scene, right? So this person, this is quite legitimate. This is an academic lecture. So I'm a senior lecturer in medical education, and then start talking more specifically. I'm a pediatrician. That's a very specific word, but more specific academic word. But the main point I wanted to show here is the contrast between the spoken and those texts that you just saw in terms of the written text. So here you're probably looking at 2,000 word families for about 95%. And this is a very common thing that we find in academic spoken English. So your learners are not going to be preparing for high levels of technical vocabulary in these spoken contexts at 95%. At 98%, things probably get a bit more serious. But if you're in the room, probably you're in the room because you have an interest or you have some background knowledge. There's a reason why you're there. Probably you've done some reading in life and medical sciences before you stepped into the room. Most university lectures get you to prepare reading in advance. So it's not random that you're there, right? So you would have some sort of, in order to get into medical school, you'd probably have some sort of background knowledge to get you there in the first place. So the main point I'm making here is just how different spoken and the written are in terms of the kinds of communication going on. So here I like to think that this lecturer knows that they are talking to people. This person's talking to other people. So they're using lots of high frequency vocabulary and probably quite a bit of support, like a PowerPoint slide or something like that behind them as well when the content gets a bit heavier. Okay, so I've given you some examples of general academic vocabulary, specific academic vocabulary, written text and spoken text. And I'm going to now give you some examples from researchers in Hong Kong, Ken Highland and Polly Say. Polly unfortunately passed away a few years ago, so we would have seen a lot more impact on her field, I'm sure, if she was still with us. But what Highland and Say said was, this general academic vocabulary, are you sure that there's a general academic vocabulary? So what they did is they looked at this idea of whether a word has a core meaning across the discipline. So does the meaning of this academic word carry through all of the disciplines, or is it the same word with different meanings? So they looked at these. I'm going to give you some examples of what they looked at. So they looked at consist, credit, and abstract. Right? Now, can you think of different meanings for those words? Consist, credit, and abstract. Yeah, nice. Exactly right. So they looked at whether or not these kinds of meanings were coming through in the corpus that they looked at. So quite right. So something being an abstract or being a theoretical concept, making payment for something or paying or acknowledging the work of other people. So what did they find when they looked across the disciplines? And here we go. So I'm going to give you a minute now to just take a look at this slide. And what I want you to do in the chat is to say what surprises you or what do you think is interesting based on this analysis. So you can see at the top, science, engineering, and social sciences. Down the side, you see the words and then those particular meanings, and then you've got the number of occurrences in those areas. All right, so I'll give you a minute now to have a think and then make some comments on what you see. So which one strikes you as the biggest contrast? How about that? I agree with you, Mark. The meaning does change greatly. Good on you, Cindy. Imagine if you had a commerce corpus as well. You might find things very different, particularly in terms of credit, for example. Oh, sorry, done it again. Okay, so the first thing I need to say is that you guys all have very good analytical skills, as I expected. And what you're picking up on is the very kind of thing that Highland and Say were saying, is that if you have these words and they have quite different meanings, then we really need to look at the context to understand more about how these words are being used. And if you're a language learner who has very much focused on understanding that credit has something to do with money, but you don't necessarily know credit has something to do with acknowledging the work of or the ideas of somebody else, then you're going to find it difficult, for example, to read text when in your head you're thinking credit means money, but actually here I'd like to credit the work of Mark, for example. That's going to be quite different, right? Okay. So we've got a couple of things here. One is that we've been looking at the kinds of text, and I'd like to finish up this particular section by saying when we're talking about our planning, we have to be thinking about some of these main ideas, like the frequency of words and what kinds of text these words are occurring in. Another thing is that idea of exposure to academic text and concepts. Learners who know more about a subject and have a lot more exposure to academic language and the abilities to talk about academic language, for example, they're going to do better overall. Now, Graham Kennedy, Professor Graham Kennedy, may he rest in peace, my professor from Victoria University of Wellington, used to tell me a story about being at university, going to a lecture and walking home afterwards, talking about it with his friend. And Graham said, he said to his friend, that's the most cogent argument I've ever heard about the topic of the lecture. And he knew at that moment that he had the word cogent. He'd only ever read it in text before. That very moment was the first time he ever used it in speaking. So there's another piece of evidence for nobody is a native speaker of academic English. I see you, Mark Dawson-Smith. Okay, another important point to keep in mind is that, and we all know this from our own learning, but if you've got existing knowledge and you have the words and you're meeting new concepts, then what you're doing is you're putting the words to the concept that you know. Or if you know the concept in your first language and then you're learning the word in the second language that connects to that concept, that's a very different point of learning than if everything is new to you, new vocabulary and new concepts. You've got double the learning going on there, right? So we have to be thinking about the kinds of concepts that are going to be new for people, as well as what vocabulary goes along with it and how much repetition they need for learning. Academic words tend to be quite long and they're made up of word parts. That's something else. So if you come from a language where short words are what your language is predominantly made up of, then you're going to perhaps struggle with learning longer words. And that's not saying you're stupid, it just means that this is more hard work for you than somebody who's used to a language where words get longer, like Hungarian. If you have lots of unknown words in text, that's a nightmare for anybody, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So we have to think about what we're doing with our text for working with our language learners, and I'll talk about this again towards the end of the talk. How much people already know. If you already know about the game of rugby, then it's much easier for you to talk about it than if you've never seen rugby before. You have no idea what's happening here. As I said before, Greco-Latin vocabulary, if you don't have much background in that, that can affect your learning of vocabulary. And in this part, I'd also like to say that the attitude of the learner has a lot to do with this. So I did research on vocabulary use in writing, and one of the things I did in that research is I actually asked students where they got their words from that they used in their writing. And most of the learners were very clear that if a university lecturer was going to read that writing, then they would make a big effort to make sure that they included academic vocabulary, both general and specific, in their writing. So they were very aware of the audience when it came to their academic writing at university level. So I wonder if we need to be very careful when we're talking about English for academic purposes and getting students to write, that we make sure that they're writing for academic purposes and that they have a clear idea of who that reader is, because it has a big impact on what they do and the language that they use. Okay, folks, now it's nearly 3 o'clock in New Zealand. So I was wondering if you want to have a short break, just a 2-minute break now, so you can go and get a quick cup of tea or a drink of water. And then I'll see you back here in about 2 minutes. Okay, so we'll just take a little break now so I can have a little drink of water, and I'll see you in a minute or two. Okay, folks. Yep, microphone a bit closer. There we go. Fenty morning tea at Laos. That's quite right. Laos is the name of our school, Linguistics and Applied Language Studies. Okay. Oh, I can see there's a storm coming from the south. So here we go. This is going to make life a little bit interesting later on today. Okay, so now you had a short break. What I wanted to do is to move now from planning. So we've been talking about what kinds of text learners might encounter and the vocabulary in those texts, to be looking at strategies for increasing their academic vocabulary size. So when we think about this, I called on the work of Paul Nation to say, well, what strategies do you think, Paul? And he said, well, I think these ones. So learners need to learn to effectively guess from context. And I'm not going to focus on that one today. I think there's a lot that's written about that particular strategy. For me, this isn't a vocabulary learning strategy. It's a way of coping with vocabulary in the text. Teaching learners how to use a dictionary is absolutely vital. And there are many dictionaries now that use academic vocabulary in terms of marking academic words. And I have a link on my website to the academic word list website, which is my website as well. But there are links of dictionaries there that have used the academic word list, for example, and marked those words as academic in the texts, in the dictionaries. Teaching learners how to use word cards. I'm also not going to focus on this one today. The one I'm going to talk about is word parts with you. So remember that I've talked before about Greco-Latin vocabulary in academic contexts. So here I decided to focus on word parts because this is something that I think is good news for teachers and learners in EAP. So it's particularly good news if you share a language that has Greek and Latin roots. So English, for example, great, we can do this because our academic vocabulary predominantly comes from those language backgrounds. I used to teach in Romania, and academic vocabulary for Romanian learners was fine because for them they had a Latin-based language, and already many of those words are in Romanian, which is very close to Italian, and for them it was much easier than for learners, for example, in Estonia, somewhere else where I taught, and that wasn't necessarily true, unless the learners had a Russian background, in which case it was much easier for them as well. One of the good things about word parts is they usually have a meaning, and I've got some for you. So your job here is to tell us very quickly of the meanings of these word parts. Go. Good. What are you doing now? Excellent. Now, if you got that far, can you give us 3 more? Really good. Post. Yeah, well done. Pre would be another good one. Hyper. Yeah, exactly right. Brilliant. Really good. So this is what I think is good news, right? The bad news is that for some languages, there's just no background there, right? Another bit of bad news can be that some roots are really closely bound, and it makes them really difficult to identify in the words. And it can be hard to find the core of a word. So there's a really long word there, anti-disestablishmentarianism. Where's the core and where are the prefixes? It is a mouthful, you're quite right. Love it. So funny. It's not a word you'd see every day. Yeah, I think establish or establishment is in the middle. And you've got some prefixes. So you've got anti. Oh, my spelling's bad. You've got anti and then dis, right? And then at the end, you've got words that make it into a noun. I'm going to have to correct that. Sorry about that. Okay. So this slide's a bit busy, but you've got some examples on the right-hand side of the screen of word parts and meanings and examples like ab, away, absent, for example. Ab is there twice. I have no idea why. I think word parts are highly teachable. So this is something that I think learners, and they often see it as something which is a little bit of a challenge, and they like it because there's direct learning happening here, right? So this is something that they know that they can start with their word attack skills. I found a list very easily, and I've just put a link there because I thought that, why not? There are other ones, I'm sure. There's a couple of things I want to say here is don't focus on them alphabetically. So one of the worst things I think we can do is start with all the ones that look the same. There is research on the frequency of word parts. You're quite right about that. And there's a test on it as well from Yosuke Sasao, and I will come to that test soon too. So the best thing I think you can do is not to focus on them alphabetically. Look at the ones, the items in context, the words in context, practice word attack skills where you break them down, and looking at those common meanings of those very common word parts. If you're going to introduce a word part or two a day, make sure you introduce ones that look very different or are not opposite to each other, because we confuse our learners very easily like that. Okay, so what else could you do to use word parts in an EAP classroom to prepare students for their academic vocabulary? Go. What other ideas have you got? I'll put one in. Yep, good. Nice idea. Linking to existing knowledge. Yep, really nice idea. So if you're going to be looking at opposites or synonyms, then you need to make sure that one of them is really well known first, and then establish the new learning from there. Otherwise, we might confuse them. I love asking students, for example. You can guarantee that there are many students in the class who have lots of really good knowledge of this as well and can teach each other. I've used word cards with word parts. That works very, very well. So you've got the word part on one side of the card, and on the back you have the meaning and some example words, and then I just get a vocab box, an old shoe box, for example, and then make sure that every time we meet a new word part, we put it into a onto a card, and then that goes into a class box of, usually I have one for word parts and then one for words that come up during the classes. One of the things I find about that word box idea is that that students find it valuable, because at the end of the class, every time I used it, somebody stole all of the words out of the box, all of the cards out of the box at the end of the course. And I never found out who, but it wasn't the same person because it was all different classes. Okay. Now, the other strategy that I wanted to talk about is word lists. And I know that the academic word list is quite well known. So I'm going to start with that one, and then I'm going to move forward to some other ones. So, So academic word lists in terms of strategies, I think. So I'm just starting with my one, not because I think that it's more important than the others, but just because I think that it's kind of an example of an early word list. Now, one of the things that I did with this was I made an assumption, which probably wasn't a great assumption, which was that if you're going to be already in New Zealand, for example, and studying at university, probably you know the first 2,000 words of English. The other assumption here is that the first 2,000 words of English don't contain academic vocabulary, but now 20 years later, we know much more. So now we know that there are high frequency words that are also academic words, right? So we've done some learning in the last 20 years, thank goodness. So we've moved on a bit. So that's one thing you need to know about the academic word list. Came from a very small corpus. Now corpora are much, much bigger, but it was balanced. 28 subject areas. In terms of the corpus. So I was looking for the words that were in common across, right? So these are general academic word lists. 570 word families. It punches well above its weight. So 10% of academic written text, and there are many studies of this using this word list, and it usually comes out about that same level if it's academic written text. Not so much of a spoken academic text. There's a website, and I've found the eapfoundation.com website. That's really, really useful, and it's got lots of these word lists in it. So I've just put it here for you, but actually go and have a look at that website because it's well worth it. It's got lots of good stuff on it. So the academic word list, so it's quite small, right? 570 word families. And because it didn't include those high frequency words, there's a point of weakness for this academic word list. So a few years ago, Gardner and Davies, and D. Gardner is also another favorite vocabulary scholar, and we've lost him too, I'm afraid, folks. But what Gardner and Davies did is they had a really big corpus, 120 million word, and it's the academic section of the Corpus of Contemporary American English. So this is called the COCA, and there's a fantastic website. So what these guys did is they started their academic word list, vocabulary list, from scratch. So they didn't assume, like I did, that everybody should know the first 2,000 words of English and that there are no academic words in the first 2,000 words of English, right? So they started from scratch. They had 9 subject areas, and their coverage with their word list is higher than the academic word list. It's 14% roughly, not 10. Now, their word list is available in 3 formats. So you can get a word family list, a lemma list, so that's a grammatical categorization, or you can get them with the word types as well. Where do you find it? At this website. It's fabulous. It's so good. And you'll also find it on the EAP Foundation website. Now, the EAP Foundation website takes these lists and if you upload your own text in this website, then it will highlight the words from the academic vocabulary list or the academic word list, for example. It's a really nice website, very user-friendly. Now, in recent work, and this is with Yen Dang, and I've talked about it as well, as the academic spoken word list. This comes from a really big corpus again, 13 million words, and this is spoken. This is hard work getting a spoken corpus together. 1,700 word families. And Yen wanted to use a disciplinary analysis so that she had hard, pure sciences like chemistry and biology, for example, soft, pure, meaning we get not so hardcore kinds of subjects, and soft applied. Applied linguistics would be an example of a soft applied area, right? If we were doing this work in Denmark, we would have wet and dry disciplines. It's all different ways of cutting the same cake. The coverage of this word list is huge. It's 90%. And it's been divided according to the proficiency of learners, right? So I'll show you why in a minute. It's available through both language learning and Yen's fabulous website, and there you've got the website there, so you can download the word list from there, and you can work with it with your texts to do some analysis. Now, the academic spoken word list is a general academic spoken word list, and the coverage is high because, as I said before, it's got a lot of high frequency words in it. Now, this word list really was, I think, one of the first to try and take the proficiency of the learners into account when you're using the word list, and I'll show you how this works. So what Yen did is divided the spoken academic word list into levels and connected it to the BNC COCA list, which are high frequency vocabulary lists from Paul Nation. So this, I'll let you have a look at this diagram now, and then I'll talk about it just a little bit more. So what do you guys see? Use the chat. What do you see there? I'll show you soon. Remember that the academic word list didn't include high frequency, first 2,000, whereas the academic spoken word list contains a lot of high frequency vocabulary. Yeah, 3,000 shows again, you're quite right. So the idea here was to say, what's the proficiency level of the students? If they have this knowledge, like the knowledge of the first 1,000 words of English, the BNC COCA list from Paul Nation, what do they do next? Then they could go to level 2 of the academic spoken word list, or they could carry on with their general high frequency vocabulary. So it's just a really nice way to say, who are you and what do you know already? Now let's use this word list. Now we've got some questions. Yeah, Takes up to level 4. Yeah, specific vocabulary. The tricky thing about that technical vocabulary in a field is that with words like area, for example, we already know that in mathematics that has a specialized vocabulary. So I imagine that the technical vocabulary there would be beyond the 3000, looking at the very technical. So those longer, more medical academic words, for example. Now, let's take a look at some research done by Coxhead and Dang, and it's a bit more data for you folks. So here you've got tutorials and labs, and remember that's small group academic speaking at university. What does this table tell us? Use the chat, away you go. What do you see? Much more. So why does the academic word list have the lowest coverage of the spoken academic texts? So I'm going to look at this table going from the bottom. Yeah, exactly right. Bingo. So there you go. So the academic word list was based on written texts, less discipline specific. Yep, that's true. So it's smaller than the other lists for a start. It's based on written text, not spoken texts. And the assumptions were that the high frequency vocabulary people would know before they started their university studies, right? So the decisions made in the developing of a word list and who the word list was being developed for has an impact on what's in the word list. I hope that that's really clear. The academic vocabulary list by Gardner and Davies, that was based on written text. It has quite high coverage of the spoken corpus, and that's because it includes high frequency vocabulary. The assumption was that you start from scratch and have no assumptions with that vocabulary list. Now, the spoken academic word list, it's a very powerful list over spoken academic texts, right? And you can see that in the coverage figures, 92 and 90%. It's very impressive. Now, there's one more word list I want to talk about in terms of general academic word lists. And it's a bit confusing because it's a science list as well. So David Hirsch and I, a long time ago, made a science-specific word list. And what we did for this is we again developed a corpus of 3.5 million words. That's quite small. Had 14 subject areas and all science-based subject areas. So what we were doing was we were saying, if learners know the first 2,000 words of English and they know the academic word list words, what comes next? So we were building this word list on the assumptions of the academic word list and of the first 2,000 words of English. This is a small word list, 318 word families, but its coverage is quite high when you consider it's quite small. So over the university science corpus that I showed you there, it's 3.79%. So it's not 10%, it's not 14%, it's small, right? That's not a surprise. Why? Because the high frequency words take up the most proportion of any text. Spoken academic texts are full of high frequency words, for example. But when we ran this science list over a corpus of secondary school science textbooks in the New Zealand context, what we found is the coverage of this word list was much higher. And I think that's quite interesting. So one of the reasons why could be because maybe the university science texts have a whole lot of other words which are technical words which were not shared across the sciences but are discipline specific, right? Maybe the secondary school science textbooks had these general science words occurring very, very often in the text, and that pushes the frequency up. So we could have several things going on here. And I thought you might be interested in that list. It's available on my website. Well, the head words are. One of the things to think about with this more specialized vocabulary is whether a word in a family is the one that is the most specific or academic in meaning. So we have to be a bit careful there with word families. But I just wanted to tell you about this word list just in case you're preparing students for the sciences, and you might find that quite useful. Now, I've been talking about general academic word lists, and there are more and more specific purposes and EAP word lists. So again, specific purposes means occurring mostly in one particular discipline. Now, we're seeing more and more work being carried out at secondary school level, and I wanted to draw your attention to this work because I think that if you're preparing students for university, probably many of them will be high school students. So I thought you might be interested in this. In the Singapore context, Green and Lambert have been working on secondary vocabulary lists where they're looking at subject specific within secondary schools. The middle school vocabulary lists by me and Jennifer Green, who's based in Atlanta. These lists are subject specific also. So there's health, English grammar, science, history. And one thing you'll find when you do any analysis of history texts is that there are lots and lots of names, so lots of proper nouns. And those kinds of words, proper nouns, are not in these lists. Again, they are discipline-specific lists. I'll just take a drink, sorry. Okay, now I pointed out some university level specific academic word lists. You can find these very easily, particularly the chemistry one and the engineering ones. The medicine one from Lei and Yu is also very easy to find. And Yin Dang has also been doing some work looking at university level spoken specific academic word list. So she has a hard science spoken word list and a soft science spoken word list. And again, really easy to find online. You just need to do a bit of searching for those. In the Thai context, we see evidence of some really interesting work with looking at what happens when you have Thai engineering students and you want to develop a basic engineering word list to support the people who have very low level of proficiency. And I wanted to talk about this list because I think it's really interesting. It's a small list and it's just types. So that means individual words, not families. Look at the coverage, over 16%, nearly 300 words, 16%. It's really high. So it's based on the engineering textbooks that are used in class. So that's really powerful, right? So the analysis was done on the text that the students would be actually using in class. When you do an analysis of the 299, many of them come from high frequency words in English. So that was West's general service list, which is what I based the academic word list on. So many of them come from the first 1,000, 28 from the second 1,000, and then 78 of them are from my academic word list. Or not from, but they also occur in these lists. And here are some examples of these words. Now, what I want you to do in this part is to say, what's your opinion in terms of if these words are general academic vocabulary or specific to engineering? I'll give you about 15 seconds. Go. Quite right, you would need to see. I mean, you can look at words like equation and value and flow. That's interesting as well. And words like used, there must be something going on there, which is in engineering that I'm not aware of as well. So the thing about the power of this kind of work is it breaks it down for learners so that they can see that these words are really important, that they're going to see them all of the time, and that they are connected directly to the subjects that they're going to be studying, the text that they're going to be studying as part of their course. Okay, now in this part, I've been talking about strategies, and I've been looking at word parts, and I've just been looking at word lists as well. And when we talk about word lists, I think it's really important to acknowledge that actually multi-word units play a major part in academic text as well. So words can occur on their own, but they can occur as part of a multi-word unit. So I'm going to be talking now about the kinds of academic multi-word lists, multi-word unit lists, and just to show you some of them and give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So when it comes to general academic multi-word lists, oh, that's a lie. These ones are specific. Sorry about that. Again, in Singapore, Green and Lambert have been looking at secondary phrase lists. So they've been looking in chemistry, for example, and looking for the very technical, for those words which occur often and together in chemistry, geography, and history, for example. In general English, you have Ackerman and Chen, and they have a really big list of academic collocations. This again was a corpus-based study. And examples of the kinds of two-word collocations that they found are basic function and critical reflection. And I've got a PhD student at the moment who's based in Vietnam, and she's doing work on academic collocations and the knowledge of academic collocations. Then we have, oh, sorry. Okay. There's another academic English collocation list by Lei and Liu. These researchers are really prolific in the work that they do. That word list is not currently easily available, but I understand it's soon going to be posted on the website for the journal article that they published on this work. And this is very big work that people are doing to try and identify these common multi-word units that belong together. The academic formulas list by Rita Simpson-Flack and Nick Ellis has 607 formulas, and I thought you might be interested in this one because what they did is they looked at formulas that were shared between writing and speaking, formulas that occurred mostly in written or written only, and then which ones occurred in spoken only. So this is really acknowledging that things are different between written text and spoken texts. And again, that EAP Foundation website also has all of those formulas there, and the researchers also looked at the functions of these formulas. So I'm going to show you some examples now. So again, this is time for a bit more of a chat. So here are some core academic formulas and what that means written and spoken. And I think that there were 207 of these. So what I'm going to do is just give you a chance now to take a look down the formulas and look at the frequency data, but also look at the rating on the side, because what these researchers did is they looked at what the corpus data can tell them. So they looked at speech and writing, and then they also talked to language experts and teachers and testers and said which ones are worth spending time on. So have a look at that and let's see some comments coming up about what you see there. Oh, what's the rating out of? I think it was out of 5. Might have been 4. Wasn't 100. Exactly right. So most of them are incomplete. Most of them don't carry any content. So you don't have words here like, I don't know, matriculation or something like heavy words that are carrying any content. And you'll see that they are mostly 3 or 4 words that come together. And I think the point will be that what comes before and after depends on the text that they occur in, right? And you'll see some similarities. So number 3, from the point of view, and then number 9, the point of view of, right? Yeah. Great. So we've been looking at some written and spoken formulas. You'll see they're all made up of high frequency words in English as well, including there is a, right? Here are some academic formulas. Now, have a look at that, and what do you notice? Yeah, correct. So we've got some comments here about the frequency, quite right. So I think you're seeing something specific about the spoken nature. You'll also see that there are some overlaps. So on the other hand, which is number one, and on the other hand, the, right? So where do you cut the multi-word unit is what's important here as well. Yep, exactly. And more formal in writing. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate these comments. It's really helpful. So one of the things that I want to say about these formulas is that often I think learners think, I know this. And I don't need to be taught a wide range of. I'm good. What I need is the highly technical vocabulary of my field. And I think that these words, because they're small and they all belong together, they tend to get missed, or people don't notice them as much. But actually, we know from research that the writers who use these kind of formulas, for example, in their speaking or in their writing, they often get marked higher in terms of the vocabulary that they display and the knowledge that they display. Okay. One of the difficulties with these items also could be that if you pull these things apart, so you make the learners look at each individual word, it can be really hard to put them back together again. And Professor Alison Ray at Cardiff University, she talks about that. So if you're going to be focusing on these items, make sure that the learners are looking at them as a chunk of language, not as each individual word. Much easier to keep it in your head. So I've been doing some talking now about word lists. And one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we finished this section about strategies with is there are some things to be careful of when we talk about word lists. I'm not talking about them being highly dangerous. I'm just saying we just need to be mindful. So one of the things to think about with word lists is why they were made. So my academic word list, for example, I was trying to find the items that were shared across academic disciplines because I was teaching classes where I would have an engineering student sitting next to an applied linguistics student, sitting next to a biology student, sitting next to a political science student. So I needed something that everybody would find useful and something that I could actually usefully teach and work with the students on. So why did the list get made? How were the lists checked? So what did they do? So for example, with the academic word list, I developed a corpus of academic written text, and I developed the word list from that, and then I developed another corpus and checked an academic written corpus and checked my word list against that one. Then I also developed another corpus of fiction text to see whether or not these words were actually academic words, and I checked the list that way as well. How were these lists made? Sometimes we get word lists that are made up of words that teachers think are really cool. Or we get word lists that teachers think, oh, I think this is a great word. But actually, we need to have principled ideas about why lists were made, why they were selected in a particular way. So I've made recently some word lists of plumbing and carpentry, for example, automotive engineering. And one of the things I find with those lists is the automatic thing that people do is they start to add words to the word list because they think, oh, this is also a word and this one's also a technical word. Part of me is happy about that because I think that that means that they see the value in keeping track of this technical vocabulary. Part of me thinks, hang on a minute, I had some principles and some reasons why some words made it onto the list and some words did not make it onto the list. And usually they were around frequency or around the meaning of those words. So we just need to be really careful about these things and making sure that we understand the principles behind how they're made. Who were they made for? Were they made for Thai engineering students who have a very low level of vocabulary and knowledge in English, in which case they needed very particular support, like we saw in the work by Ward? Were they made for medical students who are going into university? Why were they made? Who have they been made for? How big are they? The bigger your word list, the more difficult life becomes. So we need to use examples like Yen Dang's work, where she took the academic spoken word list and then she divided it into she divided it according to the frequency so that it was much easier for people to understand how proficiency can connect with using that word list. Are these lists general or specific in nature? And I put monkey see, monkey do here. So one of the things that really makes my heart sink is when I see people using word lists where they learn words start with A, and then they move to B, and then they move to C, and then they move to D. So one of the dangers of presenting a word list is if you present it alphabetically, then people think, oh, I'll start at the top and then I'll just carry on down, right? And the problem with that is you often see words that start very similarly, but they're actually quite different words. So if we use the chat now, so if I think of academic words that start with com, for example, what other words do you think you might find that are academic in nature that start with com? So you might have commerce. What else might you have? Communication. Oops, spelling's not very good. What else might you have? Comment. Yep. What else? Correct. Really good. Fantastic. So we've already got lots of words coming up where learners potentially might start getting really confused because all these words start with com. They're all long-ish. And if you know about the word part of com meaning to with or together, well, that's good. But actually, if you struggle to learn long words and you're learning them in a list, you're just going to end up getting really confused. So I think that that's really problematic. And that's my little monkey see, monkey do comment. Ooh, 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 not thinking about the learning. Okay. So we're getting there, folks. In fact, we're not far from the end. So what I've been doing here is talking about strategies, right? And then I promised that we would also be talking about another part of learning, which is to do with testing. Okay, so how are we going to find out about what our learners know? Now, one of the great things that's happened at Victoria University of Wellington and has now gone out into the world is the word part levels test, which is available. It's Yosuke Sasao did this work. He's now based back in Japan. He developed this test to have 3 levels. So it has an easy and a medium and a hard. So you can be testing your learners' knowledge of word parts. He also has a guessing meaning from context test, which isn't necessarily so related to academic vocabulary, but it's really useful to try and see how well your learners can do that what sort of skills they have in that area. I've put on my website, I've put on my website 2 versions of an academic word list test, which Paul Nation developed, I think, with Andrea Flavel a few years ago. Test A and Test B with answers. I'm making no claims about how great these things are. I'm just saying they are available. People ask me about them all of the time. John Reed at the University of Auckland has made a word association test as well that I thought you might want to take a look at. And he's really looking at the testing of these words in context as well, which I think you might find really interesting. And again, he provided the answers, and again, they're on my website. Now, there are tests coming up now with the academic vocabulary list, and the one that I suggest you take a look at is Diane Pekarari on her, Professor Diane Pekarari, who's at City University in Hong Kong, and colleagues in Sweden have developed an academic a test based on the academic vocabulary list, and they've got productive and receptive versions of that. I think the best thing to do is to take a look at a presentation that they have and the article itself. Oh, I don't remember which journal it appears in, but they've got, I'm sure that Diane's website will have the reference there. You could also take a look at Jim Milton's website for more recent research on testing academic vocabulary. Okay. So the main reason why I wanted to mention the testing element of this here is that just to show that there are tools available, and the main thing to know about these tools is, yes, they're available, but you also need to know how to use them and be very familiar with them before you give them to your learners. Just look them over very carefully, see if they're useful for you. Okay. I never dreamed that I'd still be talking about the academic word list 20 years after developing it. Okay, folks, now the last part of today before we move into the question and answer session is to be talking about the teaching side of things. Now, I know I often talk about Paul Nation, but what he talks about that really resonates with me as a teacher is he says that actually learners need to know some stuff about vocabulary. He said learners need to know about word frequency, and we've been talking about that today in terms of high, mid, and as Bhatia Laufa says, who cares? Vocabulary, low frequency vocabulary. So when I was learning various languages, I really wish I had known more about word frequency in particular. And it would have helped me to make choices about the words that I was using and why I wanted to learn the ones that I needed to learn. Lists of useful words, we've been talking about that today, particularly in terms of academic purposes. I think the next point is really important too. What is it that our learners are doing? What are the personal language choices that they're making that affects their vocabulary learning? And I had an example of a young man once in my class who came from a country which had major civil unrest when he was growing up. And his memory was really badly affected by that. It took me a long time as a teacher to find out what was happening with him. So one of the things he used to do was choose really long words in English to learn them. And I often used to say to him, "Why are you doing that? Why are you choosing those words?" And my favorite answer was, because the girls like it when I use big words. It's like, yeah, okay. What about your university studies? How about that? What about finding the words that you think you're going to really need for university? And it always reminds me when I think about him as a learner that his choices and what he was trying to do was very much related to who he was as a person and to be showing that he knew things. And I think, yeah, okay, that's fair enough. What about that learner I told you about whose husband brought home words from university? So what he was doing was trying to help educate his family on academic vocabulary. Some learners make choices like one Chinese learner I was talking to, and she said to me, you know, these collocation things, these words that go together. She said, it's hard enough learning one word, and you're telling me to learn two words at the same time. And as a teacher, I remember thinking, oh, that's a really good point, right? So I needed to be much clearer about what it was about these academic words going together that was really, really important. But I needed to know more about her as a learner in order to understand what choices she was making. Another choice she made as a learner was she said, I'm from China, and in Chinese, we like action words, we like verbs a lot. And in English, you like to count things. You have all these words to do with counting. And I was thinking, what are you talking about? And she said, you know, much, many, a lot, several, often, sometimes. These are all words about numbers. But in Chinese, we like verbs. So I noticed in class, after I observed her a little bit, you could see that anytime vocabulary came up and a word she thought was useful, it was always the verbs that she wrote down. She wasn't interested in nouns. She wasn't interested in adjectives or adverbs. She was only interested in verbs. So those are the examples of personal choice coming through in the actions of the learner. Paul also says that learners need to understand about options for dealing with vocabulary. So in other words, they need to know about the strategies of what to do when you meet different words. For example, learning word parts and why that's important. And learners also need to understand why learning some words can be easy and some words can be hard. So for example, if you have a concept in your first language and you learn that same concept in your second language and it's the same thing, but you're learning the vocabulary to go with it. Okay, that can be hard, but that's one thing. But if you don't have the concept and then you're learning the concept and the vocabulary at the same time, as I said before, that makes it even more difficult for learners. So we have to understand what is it that the learning is and why might this be hard for our learners? Is it that our learners don't have a Greco-Latin background? Is it that they don't have much knowledge or exposure to academic vocabulary and academic texts? Do they only have a very small amount of time in class and then the rest of the time they are spending their time in their first language, or they're not even engaging in English in any way? What's happening? We need to know about that. Okay, so I'm going to finish up with a couple more things. One is What about textbooks and learning? So we're seeing more and more studies happening in this area, which is fantastic. It's great to see. Sun and Dang, here she is again, Yen Dang, doing work with Chinese high school texts. And what she found is you need a lot of vocabulary to understand the textbooks that were being used. And 2 of my MA students have just finished projects, one in Indonesia and one in China. And they also find that learners need large vocabulary size to deal with their textbooks. Remember, often these students don't have much vocabulary knowledge. So Sun and Dang in the same study tested the vocabulary knowledge of the students and found that they only really knew roughly 1,000 words or under 1,000 words in English. This means the textbooks are not speaking to the knowledge of the students. Nguyen in Vietnam, another PhD student from Victoria University of Wellington, now back in Vietnam, studied Vietnamese high school textbooks and found lots and lots of new words for learners. Found that these words were really important to understand the texts, but these words didn't reoccur in the text. So they only occurred once, and then students had to move on. And Chituk says that learners would find these words very difficult to guess from context because there weren't many clues to help them. So our textbooks might be a bit dangerous, is what I'm saying here. Now, how can you work with that? Well, you could use some websites like this one. It's not a beautiful interface, but it's a very clever tool. So this is Lex Tutor. So what you do is you can put see where there's a window that says instructions. You can get your text from your textbook or anything you're using from class. You take away the text, which is their instructions and text setup and size, take that out, paste in your text. See in the middle, it says AWL. Underneath it says MSVL. MSVL is middle school vocabulary list. So you can choose the academic word list or middle school vocabulary list there. And then you hit submit window and it will tell you about the proportion of the text and the kinds of words that also are in the academic word list. Oh, sorry, the words from your text which are in the academic word list, for example, or the middle school lists. You can do that analysis here. You can also go to the websites of the academic vocabulary list that I've shown you before, and you can also upload text there and do an analysis. So what I'm suggesting here is that you could be using these kinds of tools to help you to identify academic vocabulary and text before you use them in the classroom. So you can figure out which words are repeated, which words are not repeated, which words learners need, which ones are discipline specific, which ones are general, and be very well prepared for the classroom. Then if you find that there aren't very many academic words in your text, then I think you've got another thing happening, another thing going on. So the last thing that I wanted to say is what kinds of is that we need to remember that academic vocabulary can be mid, high, or low, that there are many more high frequency words in academic spoken English than written. Academic spoken English tends not to be full of technical words. It's much more conversational, and you can see the academic spoken word list to help you with that. Learners need to aim for high levels of fluency with high frequency words because they occur in all kinds of texts. And text can contain general or specific academic vocabulary. Now, the last thing I wanted to say is what kinds of text do you need to be reading or listening to for academic vocabulary to occur? Academic text. So they need to be listening to academic spoken text and reading academic written text, but carefully prepared so that they're not full of very difficult vocabulary, depending on the proficiency level of the students. Okay, folks, so that was today's talk. You've done well to be awake. So I've looked at these things, planning, strategies, testing, and teaching a little bit at the end there. I'm going to bring up a picture of a parrot that we have in New Zealand, which can't fly and lives in trees. And I'm going to leave that picture there. And I want to know what questions you have. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Coxhead, for your magnificent presentation. Right, we learned a lot from your talk today, and I believe that you haven't disappointed our audience today. Right, so let's start the Q&A sessions. Right, some of the audience have left the question here. Right, I think we can address many of them. Number one. Does technical vocabulary mean just specific vocabulary items or common words that have a different meaning in the discipline?
It's both.
So what does it mean?
Both. So technical vocabulary can be Oh, sorry. So
Technical.
technical words can be high frequency words or mid or low frequency words, and they are usually closely connected to the discipline. So they're connected to the topic of the area. They're connected to the subject, and they can be high, mid, or low frequency vocabulary. What was the first part of the question? Oh, can I stop screen
Does
sharing?
technical vocabulary mean just specific vocabulary items or common words that have different meaning in the discipline?
Same answer. It means both. So they can
Right.
be common words that have a
Right.
specific meaning in a discipline. I saw
Right.
that there was a chat from somebody reporting
Right.
about Andy Gillett's EAP text.
Yeah.
That's a very good website. I just wanted to make sure it's here. Yeah, sorry. Carry on, Supercorn.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one. How large of a role does incidental learning play in vocabulary learning? Yeah,
So
about the role of incidental learning.
So incidental learning to me means that you're learning while you're doing other things. And so if you've got a well-balanced learning program, for example, if you follow Paul Nation's 4 strands, then you need to be making sure that learners have lots of opportunity to be reading and listening and speaking and writing about these academic kinds of concepts. The more often that they're doing that, the more chance there will be for incidental learning to take place. But I think that there really needs to be very clear strategy training, and I think learners need to really understand what it means to learn a word in English. So if they do notice it incidentally, and sometimes that can come through into their own language learning, but sometimes they're going to have to work hard because some words are easier to learn than other words, easier to notice than other words. So it's not going to happen for everything.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the next question. Which one is more useful or which one works better between, number one, memorizing words from word lists or vocabulary books versus reading extensively? Which one works better?
Depends on your purpose, right? So reading extensively usually is about encountering high frequency vocabulary through things like speed reading programs or extensive reading programs. So if learners are focusing on academic vocabulary, then it does make sense to have narrow reading programs happening where they're reading a lot in a particular area to develop their understanding of key concepts and develop their language skills. In terms of memorization does play a role in terms of learning vocabulary, but we have to remember that memorization is one thing and the use of the vocabulary is another, right? So it's really important that learners also have opportunities to use the words that they're memorizing, using them in their speaking and using them in their writing.
Okay,
as much
thank
as
you very
and getting
much.
feedback,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. The next question, are there any extensive reading or listening resources for officially learning academic vocabulary? Can you suggest any?
Okay, so I think that that's a tricky question because you can get books that are called dummies guides to economics or dummies guides, so it's easy reading for academic purposes. One of the pieces of research that I did recently was looked at the use of TED Talks. So if students are listening to TED Talks and using transcripts on the TED Talks websites, what about the academic vocabulary in TED Talks? So there was a couple of things there. One was TED Talks had a very heavy vocabulary load. So they were much more like academic written texts than academic spoken texts. So learners to reach 98% coverage, remember that's really high coverage, right? They need to know a lot of words. That was about 8,000 word families. So these TED Talk texts are not so much like spoken text, they're much more like written texts. So they do contain about 4% academic word list words, for example. So they're a really useful source of reading and listening. And if your learners don't know much about the subject, but they have translations of the text on the website, then you could start by using the Thai text or the Indonesian text so your learners understand the language and understand the content. and then move to the English text. So you can use those transcripts really wisely, I think. But you need to make sure that the learners pay attention to the vocabulary, not just that they learn it, they understand it in terms of the listening and the reading, but they then do something towards learning it.
Right.
So that's when you could get word cards and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, so we also have some questions from YouTube audience as well. This one is from Vietnam. Could you possibly tell us about some methods of measuring a learner's academic vocabulary size? Yeah, this is about measuring learners' academic vocabulary size.
Okay, so at the moment, I don't know of any research that targets the idea of a vocabulary size of academic language, but there are tests that test the knowledge of words that appear on academic word lists. So these lists don't contain all of the academic vocabulary in the world. They contain a subset of it depending on how they made the list. So in the presentation, I talked about tests on my website that look at the academic word list, for example, and the academic vocabulary list example as well. But I don't know of anything that looks at general size of academic vocabulary. If you know of something, I'd love to hear.
Okay, thank you. Right. Let's move on. In teaching students vocabulary, you know, how can you deal with a situation, you know, in some classrooms, you know, they are of students of mixed English proficiency, right? How can you cope with that?
In terms of academic vocabulary knowledge, I would test their vocabulary knowledge of, for example, the academic word list to start with, and I would use the vocabulary levels test as well to try and find out who knows what, roughly. And then I would be using strategies like word parts, and I'd be using word cards in boxes to be making sure that we keep track of the vocabulary that's coming up in the classroom, which is for academic purposes, making sure everybody has access to all of those resources. Because one of the dangerous things I think can happen in class is that we mention words and then we talk about them in terms of a text for the classroom, and then the learners don't ever see those words again. So it's really important for the learners who have lower proficiency in particular to be talking about the kinds of words and making sure that the next time you meet the class that there's revision of the words that you found in the last class, and hopefully that they're reading another text which uses similar words. So we need to be really careful with these learners. Another thing that we could be doing is taking the idea of getting an academic text and then analyzing the vocabulary in the text using that LexTutor website, for example, taking out all of the low frequency words and replacing them with higher frequency words. And if you do that, then you could prepare the text for the learners who only know 3,000 word families in English. So then you'd say, okay, Avril, here's your text. You have a smaller vocabulary size. You're reading the same text as everybody else, but the vocabulary is controlled. For the other students, if you, Supercorn, you have a vocabulary of 5,000 words of English, I've controlled the vocabulary in this text so that you can understand it better, because you have a bigger vocabulary than Avril, and so I'm going to be working on it on the same text, but it's going to be changed in terms of the vocabulary in there. That's another way of dealing with it. So you know the texts that you're using in class really, really well, and maybe adapt them for the levels of the students that you've got.
Right.
And you're not saying to the students, you are stupid. Here you go. Here is the stupid student text. It's not about that at all. It's just saying, to be the most successful learner you can be, you need to be reading these texts at a level where you can understand them, and you're helping them with that. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you.
Anik's here. Anik.
Right. Yeah. This is from, I think, a Japanese scholar. How many words do you think is necessary for high school students to be prepared for reading basic academic text?
Yeah. So we've actually started to do more work on secondary school vocabulary in secondary school texts. And one of the things that we find is that sometimes these texts are actually really difficult. And one of the purposes of doing more research on the text in secondary school is to really see how hard are these texts? How is vocabulary being dealt with in these texts? And one thing I'd really love to do is to find out how our students use these texts for learning vocabulary, whether or not they do. What is it that they do in order to learn these words? Or do they just go, oh, this word is just in this text, I don't need it, so I'm just going to ignore it and carry on. So I think we should be doing more work in this area. So the answer is, actually, we haven't got enough research to answer your question yet, but we do know a little bit more because of Nguyen, Chiduk's work in Vietnam, Sun and Dang's work in China, my MA students. We know much more about the vocabulary in our EFL textbooks, but secondary school texts, you might want to take a look at Coxhead and Butterwick. That will tell you a bit more about that. Oh, sorry, I'm not sharing. This research we looked at, we analyzed texts to see how big a vocabulary size you need. One thing that's really important that we found in our research is that the materials that the teachers prepare and give to students in class has a very is really targeted to the level of the learner's vocabulary. So the materials that teachers give students in classes are often much more understandable for learners than the textbooks. So there, I think we see evidence of teachers working really hard to help students understand the textbooks more.
Right, thank you.
Oh my goodness.
Right.
There's an evaluation form. Wow.
Right,
okay.
right. Yeah, the evaluation forms will come later. I mean, after the webinar. Okay, let me emphasize to you guys that don't leave. I mean, after the webinar finishes, right, you see the evaluation form automatically. Please kindly, do the evaluation form. I think, okay, the last question for today. Should we supplement textbook with more academic texts from the actual fields? Maybe authentic text.
I think it depends on the knowledge level of your learners. So one thing that happens in New Zealand secondary schools is if students are learning in the trades, then often the trade industry organizations choose the materials for the students. And that means that the students have to read really difficult text. That means that it's not easy for these students to deal with the text. So I think that if you think about it, rather than thinking, oh, I have to give them textbooks of this area, you could be saying, I'm going to use topics to deal with that are in this general area. I'm going to analyze the texts that are that I'm using so that I know what vocabulary is in them, and I'm going to be making sure that my learners follow up on the words that they know that they need to learn. Learners are not dumb, right? Learners make real decisions about the vocabulary that they want to learn and why. So that's why I think it was really important at the end of my talk to talk about what is it that learners need to know. They need to know about frequency. They need to know about discipline-specific vocabulary. They need to understand that there's such a thing as academic vocabulary that's general across text as well. So the more that they are prepared to understand more about academic vocabulary and why it's important, I think that then you're helping them to learn to fish rather than giving them fish. Does that make sense? So you're helping them with what they need to do. Okay.
Yes. So thank you very much, Professor Coxhead, today for your brilliant talk, right? I think, we have covered most of the questions, right? And, some of the questions are very similar, right? So, we are very happy today and lucky to have, Dr. Coxhead with us, right? From New Zealand, right? And Dr. Coxhead is kind enough to give a talk, in her afternoon tea time, right? Okay. So we hope that, in the near future, we might have you again, right? On any other topics, right? Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Coxhead.
So thank you, and thank you to everybody for coming today. It's been really wonderful meeting you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And please don't forget to do the evaluation form for us, right? Thank you very much. Okay. Your feedback is very important. Thank you.
I'm just watching the comments. Lovely.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.